To expand on this issue some more, I'd like to welcome on British author and journalist Douglas Murray, joining us from London. Douglas, I really appreciate you joining us tonight. A lot of your works actually directly apply to what's happening right now in both British and U.S. politics, and especially here in the U.S. right now. There's a little bit of this divide about when it comes to more progressive individuals, such as Senator Bernie Sanders. A lot of his supporters bring up these big, grand ideas, and a lot of conservatives then say, well, that's beautiful in theory, but it's not exactly appropriate in application. It doesn't necessarily work. Do you think that's a trend that's kind of going across the world right now, is kind of putting ideology and wants ahead of what's actually plausible?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you. Secondly, more importantly, there has been a trend for a long time, which is similar to something you identify, whereby, broadly speaking, the left, as we call it, suggests ideas, and the right, or certainly conservatives, sort of resist them and fight the next battle they're going to lose. Something slightly different from that is happening at the moment, and this is what I write about in particular in my latest book, In the Madness of Crowds, on gender, race, and identity, is something is effectively a sped up version of the thing I have just described, whereby the craziest imaginable ideas, indeed ideas so fringe that almost nobody is absolutely sure what they mean, are pushed to the fore, in part to rub conservatives' noses in it, in part to say, here is a test, here is a hurdle we bet you can't leap over. And then when conservatives fail to, they can be denounced as bigots, racists, homophobes, transphobes, and a whole world of other phobias that you and I may not have even heard of yet.
And that's an idea, too, that seems to be facilitated by certain institutions. I mean, a lot of conservatives, for example, will say that the media facilitates the narrative when it comes to a lot of these issues. They'll also say, for example, when it comes to you bring up trans issues, that on social media platforms, you can't necessarily even have that debate. It's kind of within itself inherently one-sided in the sense that certain rules only apply to one side of the debate. Do you think that's something that we see maybe from social media companies or from journalism as well?
Well, it's worth identifying the fact that there are things that are going on the social media platforms, which I identify in the book and elsewhere, which are certainly basically forms of censorship, trying to make sure one opinion is privileged over another. But we are allowed to say things. I mean, one of my self-appointed tasks as a writer is to say the things that most people know to be true but aren't in a position to say. Aren't in a position to say because their workplace, their boss, their circle of friends and others might stop them from saying so. But nevertheless, there are things which are allegedly unsayable, which are also true. As for the role of the media in it, just one other thing, which I go back to this fact that in America in particular, I'm an observer of America. I'm not a participant in it. As an observer of America, it's very clear now that the social issues that I identified chapter by chapter, gay, women, race, and trans in particular, have effectively been used since 2016 as a way to punish the electorate for voting the wrong way. That is, effectively, the New York Times, for instance, and other publications, wants to push a bunch of stuff down the American public's throat, not just because it thinks it's good for them, but because it thinks it'll piss them off and make them expose themselves as the bigots that these publications think they are. By the way, this has a link to 1960s radicalism. There was always a view among the 1960s radicals that if you insulted the police enough, then they would, for instance, punch you in the face and reveal in doing so the true fascist nature of the American regime. Is something very similar now. What's being done is an attempt to provoke the American public into revealing that they are these horrible, bigoted, racist people. And of course, the flaw, among other things, is that they're not going to reveal this because, broadly speaking, the American public, like the British public, is fairly decent and doesn't like a lot of crazy stuff.
And building on that point, too, we also see that, for example, conservatives will look at those on the left and say, oh, they're socialists, they're communists. They kind of almost expand on that idea a little bit, whereas those on the left will look at a lot of those conservatives, for example, and say, oh, as to your point, you're bigoted, you're a Nazi, for example. So it kind of seems like it's a polarized extreme as far as insults going on both sides. How do you really define the political spectrum that we're in right now? Is it still conservative liberal, or do you think that it's kind of shifting a little bit?
It is shifting. It's always shifting. The late Roger Scruton famously said that the problem with the left-right divide was that whereas he was perfectly happy to debate with leftists, he found that leftists were unhappy to debate with him because they didn't just think he was wrong but evil, whereas he thought that the left was simply misguided. Something different is coming in. That is changing a bit. We have extremes on all sides, of course, and all have to be alert to them. But I think that's what's happening now is that broadly speaking, a sort of sensible, ordinary opinion is getting lost from the debate, so that one only hears the most extreme parts of the debate. And this is a shame, among other things, because there are really interesting and important social issues we need to think about. We do live in a society, and Americans in particular live in a society where race is coming back into the forefront of the discussion under the guise of anti racism. So that, for instance, white gets used as a term of insult, so that people are effectively made to feel as if they should be ashamed for being heterosexual, much in the same way as some people in the past were made to feel, or many people in the past, most people were made to feel ashamed for being homosexual, and on and on. And I think these are culture wars that politics touches on, but doesn't yet, certainly on the right, have a very good answer to. There is an answer, which comes in the form of Trump, among other things, which is to say, anyone who tells you you can't say what you like, we're now going to play back at that by electing a president who seems to say exactly what he likes, whatever the consequences. Nevertheless, that's not quite the answer. There are really tricky corners to all of these social justice issue debates we have at the moment. Debates around things like inequality, for instance, as well, which we're just not having because they are all debates where the only people who are thinking about them or willing to talk about them are people who have the worst answers, i.e., for instance, socialism. And so we have a lot of problems in our societies, but they start always with the problem of having to assert our right to speak and think in public, including thinking aloud, without being censored or censured for doing so.
Sure. And there's a lot of similarities right now between the U.S. and the U.K. I mean, the Brexit decision, for example, a lot of people say kind of foreshadowed President Trump's victory in 2016. And of course, you just had a deciding election in your own country that kind of rejected the Labour Party a little bit. A lot of people say that's either because of their far left. A lot. It was, in fact, a historic victory for conservatives in your country, which kind of rejected the Labour Party, whether that is because of claims of anti-Semitism, just far left policies, whatever it may be. A lot of people say that could be a preview of what's to come here in 2020. But in both countries, there seems to be kind of the same idea where an idea of Marxist ideology is kind of going up against something known as nationalism. It's kind of a new term that people like to throw around, but by no means is it actually new. Why is it, do you think, that those types of ideologies right now, whether it be kind of that far left Marxist type of ideology or this newfound kind of conservative nationalism or populism, why do you think those are the two ideologies right now taking place across the world, not just in those two countries?
I reject the idea that they are. Firstly, populism, by the way, is a very ill-defined term in the way it's used these days. Mainly, it's used for anything that's popular, as we used to say. The second thing is, I mean, nationalism isn't new, but in Europe, at any rate, it has a lot of negative connotations.
Sure.
The reason why there is a play about nationalism at the moment going back is because it's hitting back at people who claim that they want to live in a world of open borders, the borderless world, which is being advocated by some people on the extreme left. This could be one of those unintended consequences issues where, some people who pretend to want to live in a borderless world. And by the way, if anyone did ever live in a borderless world, it would be utter chaos because, you've got to pay your taxes somewhere. But the play back at that is coming from people saying, well, let's do nationalism more. I'm not a nationalist myself. I am a patriot. But I do think that there is an element to which, yes, this is some kind of playback at people making a crazy claim. Again, I mean, one has to be careful to make sure that you don't end up having political discussions on the terms of your opponents. We in Britain didn't do anything nationalistic when we voted for Brexit. We simply said in the most decent and legitimate way possible at the ballot box that we thought that we didn't know how we were governed anymore, and we'd like to know how we're governed. And I, at any rate, refuse to allow that to be depicted as nationalism. It seems to me to be, to use another rather loaded but decent term, absolute common sense.
Yeah, and it seems to be those two terms are oftentimes weaponized by the two sides. To your point, though, to kind of avoid actually having the debate when it comes to actual policy differences, it's kind of one of those things where they just want to brush off and call each other names and go just kind of avoid the conversation altogether. But I wish we could talk about these topics more. But all our viewers, you can check out Douglas Murray's new book, The Madness of Crowds. It just came out last year. Phenomenal book. Douglas, I really appreciate you coming on tonight and providing us with your insight.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.